Welcome, everyone. I'm Kyle MacDonald, a project leader and venture builder at BCG, who in a prior life spent over 8 years in family offices. But today, I'll be your host for Simple's webinar on family office recruitment and executive search. To those joining us for the first time, Simple powers the next generation of family offices through end-to-end products and services that make the family office journey straightforward. To access actionable insights and solutions from today's webinar, you can access our family office security and risk report by heading over to our family office website at simple.co or by scanning the QR code on screen. Joining me on today's panel, we have Brasata Dani. So Brasata is the founder of Himmendale Executive Search, a European firm with global expertise, founded in 2016. She has vast experience in private equity, venture capital, and sovereign wealth funds, working with conglomerates and startups. Previously with a leading London firm, she has built management teams across the US, Europe, and the Middle East. Known for her exceptional delivery and a creative approach, she advises corporates and family offices. Absolute pleasure to have you.
Right.
Next up is Brian Adams. No relation to the singer, Brian C. Adams. So Brian is a principal at MAC International, a leading executive search and human capital consulting firm that serves the family office and wealth management markets. Along with his background in family offices, Brian has co-founded 2 real estate private equity firms, Excelsior Capital and Priam Properties, and has assembled a portfolio of over 600 million in real estate assets. Pleasure to have you, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
And next up is David Chai. So David manages executive searches across the private equity with a focus on tech founder family offices. So that's from anything from a billion to 150 billion assets under management, and has placed candidates in executive roles at Stanford University, Google, WhatsApp, Sequoia Capital, Facebook, Inuit, Meta, Airbnb, Oracle, Carlyle, the list goes on. As you can see, David is also an avid early adopter and investor, and is an investor in over 100 seed through to pre-IPO startups. So absolute pleasure. Great to have you here as well, David.
Thanks.
Perfect. So really looking forward to unpacking everything that sort of has to do with the family office executive search space. The aim of today's session, for those of you joining in, is just to outline how next-gen family offices are winning at finding, attracting, and retaining world-class talent by sort of leveraging executive search and recruitment to their advantage. So some of the agenda for the call today, we're going to understand a little bit more about what is it that makes a family office a unique environment, understanding what does executive search mean in the family office space, where to begin as a family office, how do you navigate the process, and then where are we today and where is the sector going? So perhaps I'll dive right into questioning, thinking a little bit more about what is it that makes family offices such a unique environment to work in and be recruited for. So I might start with you, Brasata.
Okay. Well, it's to do with the economic climate at the moment. So we've seen, of course, what's happened in the private equity world and the venture capital world. And there's about 15,000 family offices around the world. Most of them or 60% of them were created after the year 2000, which came from the dot-com bubble. And we, of course, with COVID happening, there's been a lot of unrest in the VC world and private equity world, where companies the whole focus was that you have an exit within 5 to 6 years or 7 years. And we've had quite a lot of family offices that have popped up after COVID. So they were able to exit the companies quite quickly. And then whatever, 250 million or $500 million that they had, they've decided to now open their own family office. And there was 2 reasons for that. One of the main reasons was the 2% fee that they were not willing to pay to venture capital companies and private equity companies. And also what we're seeing was companies were being sold from PE1, PE2, PE3 within 5-6 years. So all these ultra high net worth individuals thought, well, actually, instead of doing that, why don't we create our own family office? And we have more control. We're going to be at the helm of it. and we can invest how we want to. And instead of having these exits where, you know, the private equity owners and the VC owners, it was in their best interest to have an exit as quickly as possible, because they only get paid a 2% management fee. They thought, why don't we do this ourselves and actually keep the company for 20 years instead of having a quick exit and having no control over our wealth. And a lot of that investment that they made is not guaranteed now, because a lot of the VCs, especially around Europe, their portfolios are going under. And when you lose 2 to 3 portfolios, of course, you're not going to have your return on investments. So the family office world has become, of course, it's still very mysterious, but it's become a very appealing place for a lot of entrepreneurs and young people that they want to enter into, because the exits are no longer happening within the PE world. Or, of course, not in every PE world, because it's quite controversial to paint them all with one brush. But that's what we're seeing at the moment. So there is a strong appetite to work for a family office, and also more stability. So you can stay there for 10 to 20 years. They're not looking for someone that wants to jump ship immediately after a few years. So it's become a high demand area for people to enter.
And maybe a question for you, Brian. So thinking a little bit more about, you know, these traditional structures, whether that's from PE funds, VC funds, or maybe even investment banks, or beyond, you know, how are family offices quite different in terms of a working environment for those who join these organizations?
Despite the fact that they've become much more professionalized and institutionalized, there's still a lot of flexibility within the org chart. So compared with working with a traditional Wall Street investment bank or private equity firm or asset manager, you get exposure across a broad spectrum of wealth management and asset management. So, you know, you can learn a little bit about concierge services, trust and estate, investing, tax, accounting, bookkeeping, technology. So you can touch all components of what kind of drives the family office forward. And that's really appealing to a lot of people, especially young people. And I'm sure we'll get into more of this, but I think the advantage obviously is that permanent capital base, right? So like we've talked about, they don't have this churn of every 5 to 7 to, I think the average PE firm is actually more like 12 to 15 years on turn, but they're not recycling capital and chasing IRR, so they have to go back to the market constantly. So there's that sense that they have more flexibility. And then at the same time, they've become really competitive alongside venture capital and private equity firms in terms of allocating capital and looking at deal flow. Obviously, they become much larger. And so you get the opportunity to look at much more unique deal flow as well. And so I think just to become very competitive alongside the mainstream traditional firms when you think of them as kind of a standalone investment office. And then frankly, having fewer clients is really appealing to people, right? So if you're coming from a traditional Wall Street firm where your LPs are non-taxable pension plans at insurance companies and endowments, where they're really kind of nameless, faceless organizations that cycle through their own leadership positions, to be able to have a deep relationship with the principals and the clients directly that you can build for 20, 50 years has become very appealing to people who, let's be honest, who from Wall Street seems to blow itself up every 3 to 5 years. So it's a very attractive spot for a lot of really talented people today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, Brian, David, thinking a little bit about, you know, how there is this shift in appetite for candidates to move into this space, but also thinking a little bit about, you know, when you go out and actually start looking for candidates, where are there sort of typical overlaps with skills that make, you know, candidates particularly, you know, transferable into this new sector for them, and you know, where are there actual skills that might be even quite desirable in comparison to traditional family offices?
I think with Silicon Valley, I've found that a lot of the founders that we're working with are looking for the highest quality talent, not necessarily from the family office space. they're typically used to sort of having the highest caliber individuals around them, and so they want that, whether that's from a lifestyle perspective or from investors, and they offer sort of, as Brian said, a larger ability to touch on a lot of different asset classes, which is not necessarily the case if they're going to go into just a regular VC or a PE firm. So in terms of the transferable skills, I think there's sometimes there's candidates that are just kind of tired of going through the cycles and are ready to kind of be excellent in their field and work with these exciting individuals to deliver these long-term returns and so on.
That makes sense. And Prasada, thinking a little bit more about, obviously two angles. One is from the wealth owner perspective, but the other is from, a candidate-centric perspective. Beyond the brains and hard work, what is it that wealth owners and family offices are looking for when it comes to candidates?
Well, the great servant, actually. They need someone that is a safe pair of hands. And Brian and David probably can relate to this. You meet certain people and you think you're an exceptional COO, where they can do anything from tax. They're able to understand how the accounts work within the family office, are able to do deal making. They have the risk appetite and etc. So we always look for that sort of great servant, someone that is a steady pair of hands, that is not a contrarian. You need to a degree a yes man, because imagine you've got the wealth owner at the helm of this. They need, they're dealing with a very sensitive topic, which is their money and their entire wealth. And a lot of them would have been people that I typically would see will be second or third generation wealth. So there's a lot of pressure from these new wealth owners to be able to do a good job from it and have the right people alongside with them. So it's a steady pair of hands, essentially, and that they can trust.
I would echo that. We always look for what we refer to as a service mentality, right, or a service heart. I think the technical skills, considering how competitive the marketplace is today, they're table stakes in my opinion. So it's really a function of can we find the right culture fit. And by culture fit, we do mean that service heart. So we look for things, in the States, people that served in the military, people that played college team sports, especially at a lower level, especially maybe a niche sport where they have no opportunity to go anywhere with it, but they just really love to be part of a team and achieve things together. Boy Scouts, Eagle Scouts, Girl Scouts, all those type of things really go towards it. And it leads to this kind of follow-on question of this concept. There's nothing kind of too small, right? There's no task too small. And if it's important to the family, it's important to the family. I think one of the things people struggle with on the candidate side is if they were a managing director at Goldman, something along those lines, they have a very specific scope and they do one niche thing very, very well. Whereas even if you're working at a big institutional family office, you're the chief cook and bottle washer. And some days you're allocating capital, interviewing GPs and sponsors. Another day you're figuring out what summer camp the next generation needs to go to and working your network to get them access to whatever school they need to be able to go to. So there is nothing too small. And that really goes to when you wake up in the morning, do you have that service orientation, that service heart?
Yeah, 100%. And I think also
sorry to interrupt you. I would add to that. It's a high IQ and high EQ that really goes along with this person. That they have to be very sensitive to the people that they are working for. And that's why they look for that long-term person that's going to stay in the company for 10 to 20 years. And they usually never leave, if I'm honest. So sorry, just to add to
that was exactly my point. I was going to say the sort of EQ question, comes into factor and play quite a lot. From my years in the sector, very much understand, you're working with and for people. And I think that needs to be sort of front and center beyond obviously having exceptional technical skills. Perhaps more a question for you, David, is, so if you're thinking about a family office they've just had a liquidity event, they're thinking about setting up a family office for the first time. What is that typical sequence of hiring that you see sort of within the tech space? And maybe I'll sort of bounce this back to Brian and Basada as well, in your experiences as well. But maybe Brian, over to you. So what would you sort of see as the typical sequence of hiring?
Obviously, every family is a little bit different, but when you're talking about a de novo startup family office, we work with a number of them. We're actually working with a large one in Dallas right now. And we really strongly advocate for hiring that expert generalist. So somebody that has all of the facility across the spectrum of wealth and asset management. They may not be an expert in trust and estate law or private trust companies or investing per se, but they know enough about those things to be able to be, as Prashant just said, that safe pair of hands for the principal and the family. And then everything kind of follows along from there. So we generally advocate for somebody that maybe has 10 to 15 years of family office experience or worked at a professional services firm that kind of worked alongside those type of families. A profile in the States would be somebody with kind of a JD, CPA, MBA, maybe a public accounting background, or worked at a kind of high level trust and estate law firm where they were really more of a consigliere and a consultant in a lot of ways, as opposed to just kind of blocking, tackling, and producing widgets. So titles in family office world are very fluid and dynamic. So you can call them the CEO, the president, the chief operating officer. Sometimes it's the CFO, but oftentimes it's really just finding that kind of expert generalist. And what we typically see is the comfort level from the principal. If they themselves came out of law or accounting or private equity or investment banking, you probably want to find somebody with a similar DNA, because even though the skill set might be variable, they're going to feel more comfortable with that shared background and pedigree oftentimes.
Yeah. And David, do you see that sort of shifting in Silicon Valley?
I think that I think we definitely look for those sort of chief operating officer component, someone that can continue to move things going forward, and also that has that general approach to understanding who they're going to be hiring, can sort of be that right-hand person in establishing. It's going to set the often we place attorneys into this space. Actually, I've noticed this quite frequently recently, because there's so much nuance to the legal issues that they're going to be dealing with. So I recommend that to a lot of individuals, but it really depends on the principal, as Brian said, where they're coming from, what their objectives are. If they're looking to drive philanthropic work, it's going to be very different to them driving their investment work or creating new startups or whatnot. So, but a generalist that has a strong operating capacity is high.
Yeah. And Brasada, how do you sort of see that sequence? So say, for example, you hire this generalist, perhaps, then sort of what's the next port of call? Who do you hire next?
We usually hire the investment director. So the type of family offices that I work for, as I mentioned earlier, is either multifamily office or someone that's had a conglomerate, that's a third generation wealth. And they will have venture on the side. So it's not that you're typical where you're sort of doing the sort of tax or moving the family into Switzerland. We're usually looking more on the investment part of it. So they will either have another VC on the side, which is there. So you typically have an umbrella, and it's split into 3 different streams. And so you have like a holding company, you have a family office, and then you have a VC. And they usually invest in things that they're sort of passionate about. And we need to find a great investor for that, that can manage all their portfolios. So what I'm seeing at the moment, especially in the Middle East, is they are buying a lot of football clubs, because they're passionate about football and sport. So which is very different to some of the family offices here in Europe, for example. So you need a strong investment director, you need a strong chief of staff. And these types of people will usually come from either McKinsey, so a strategy house, or BCG, or they come from Goldman Sachs. But the struggle that we typically have, especially for multifamily offices, is usually that if you bring someone from Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, they usually want someone like themselves that they understand. So there's almost like an allergic reaction to having somebody from, the other competing bank, let's say. So it's essentially building blocks around it. But with conglomerate families, what we've seen is that there is one major family office that they have, and then all the cousins will have their own split family offices around it. So when there is a good deal on the table, they will usually go to the main family office to see if they all want to invest, or especially when this deal might be a little bit high risk. So it's an interesting split. Or they pass on the companies, just like you would see in a VC world. Series A goes to one VC, and then they give it to their friends who's Series B. So that's what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, another thing is the CFO, where we notice that they don't have any structure around their incoming and outgoing cash flows. And so they need someone to create the structure to be able to support that and be able to manage the reporting aspect, and you can get shopping pretty quickly, and there's a lot of transactions that are going on, and you need to have someone that can put some controls in place, because often that is not something that's thought about, especially particularly if they're entrepreneurs or so on.
Yeah, great
point. Yeah.
So maybe diving a little bit deeper into thinking about executive search from a family office perspective. How should a family office go about engaging an executive search firm, like any of yours, and how do they get the ball rolling? So maybe I'll start with you, Brian. How typically do you find new clients approach you, and what should they expect?
It obviously depends on the fact pattern and the family. I'd say it's 50-50 for us in terms of, sometimes we participate in a formal RFP process where, there's a bake-off, and they'll go to 3 different firms. We'll do a Zoom interview. They'll have a written RFP, and then we'll move to graduate to an in-person meeting. Other times it's an introduction from a trusted advisor, and we have a great initial call, and we're known in the marketplace to be the most niche, specific family office search firm. And so it just is a really good fit right away, and they've got a need to get started. So I'd say either way, oftentimes it will depend on the provenance of the family. If they come from an institutional background, they're going to want to run a process. Whereas if it's a de novo and they're an entrepreneur, oftentimes they won't. The multi-generational institutional firms typically have a search committee, right? So they've got more structure. They've got a board. They have an investment committee. They have a family council. They'll constitute a search committee, and they'll go to the market. Whereas the startups obviously don't have that infrastructure. So we typically don't run that process. And then it kind of goes from there. But I think it's a really good opportunity to institute governance and have these hard conversations internally. And what we always advise families, even if they are multi-generational and we're finding kind of a replacement to a longtime CEO or CFO or CIO, let's take the opportunity to revisit these 3 kind of big structural questions that every family should ask, which is, who are the clients? What is the family office? Who are they serving? What is the scope of those services being provided? Are we going to be holistic, providing everything from concierge to bookkeeping to investment management to trust and estate work to bill pay to estate management, et cetera? Or are we going to be largely investment oriented or just administrative back office? And then based on who the clients are and what the scope of services are, what should be insourced versus outsourced? And oftentimes that's a very dynamic, fluid conversation these days with technology and compensation going up. And we found that these C-suite positions have really greater responsibility oftentimes because this middle management has really been hollowed out by technology and some of the advancements they've been able to make. But it just means that the responsibility is greater on a lot of the C-suite executives in particular. So we have a consultative approach when we talk to these families, but I would say, based on how you feel comfort, either you go to the market, but I would ask around, right? I mean, I think, again, based on your comfort level of the DNA of your family, it will really dictate who the right fit is in terms of how you go about conducting the search. But as a candidate, we always feel really comfortable when we were able to go to them and say, hey, the board put together a search committee with representation for the next gen, and then could they have a proxy vote from the family council, et cetera. And they've done a compensation study, right? They've brought in a third-party comp consultant to understand what the market is and what the structure should be. That's obviously very encouraging. And it's a great foot forward for us when we go to the market. So I would encourage families to explore and really get prepared, because oftentimes we see them come in and say, we need somebody in the seat by Jan 1. This is a 6-month process, I think, soup to nuts, realistically. So the more patient and organized you can be, I think the greater level of success you'll have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess thinking a little bit more about, what types of roles typically your firms focus on. Maybe I'll start with you, Prasada. So thinking a little bit about, it's obviously an interesting wild world out there in the family office sector. Are you typically focused just on the C-suite? Do you focus beyond that? Maybe over to you.
No, we focus primarily on CEO, CFO, COO, and we can go to director level depending on the size of the family office. Titles they don't mean very much, not just in family office, but it's I'd say in 40% of the industries. So it depends how big they are. If they're on the 10 billion scale, then the director is actually a very senior person. But what we see in the Middle East a lot is that they are very secretive as family offices. They do not open the doors to anybody, and no one knows what the other family is doing, essentially, and they really want to protect that at all costs. So all of our searches are confidential, and even though we look for these senior people, there is a level of where not necessarily a frustration, but we advise the family offices they should use headhunters, because you must be able to go out there and find the best person that is available, not just someone from your friends and family. But what we've seen actually, the C-suite, majority of the time, I'd say 70% of the time, they will usually find someone from their own network. And it doesn't necessarily work out. But so what they do is they bring a very smart director, where we come in to find that person, or a smart COO to support the CEO. But it's all about trust. And if you look at the sheikhs and the royal families within the region, all of their fathers, all their families will invest together. So they are heavily involved in business. And if one of their children is at a certain level, then it will go from one family office to another, essentially. So, but we focus on the C-suite, and we've got a very close relationship. So I typically work alongside as an advisor for them. And I also introduce them to other family offices in Europe, hoping for co-investments. And this has been in particular for me in the sport industry. So with football clubs. So that's been a way for us to get them to trying to co-invest and potentially move a person from one family office in Europe to Middle East. And it's beginning to work. So it's yes, we're seeing some results from this.
Fascinating. Maybe a question for you, Brian. So thinking a little bit about sort of from a talent-centric or maybe candidate-centric point of view, how do sort of the best-in-class executives get and raise the flag and raise their hand and say, this is a sector I'm interested in. How do they get in touch and find out?
It can be, I think it's changing, but it can be a very opaque, clubby space, right? And so oftentimes what we will advocate to families is, they should use a recruiter, because we have access to candidates that you don't, because in this world, even though the family office ecosystem is expanding and it's continues to grow, it's still a pretty small world, and a lot of candidates will trust our confidence and discretion and privacy and know that we may speak with them for 10 years. No one else would ever know, but that's where they can see real opportunities coming across, because they won't obviously want the world to know that they put their hand up and that they're interested. But, we have access to that cohort of candidates. I think the skill set is really useful of being thoughtfully persistent with recruiters like myself and making sure that you know who all of the real players are in the space, because that's the same skill set that you would need to apply in a high functioning family office. The ability to network, the ability to access certain circles to make sure you're in the right conversation, in the right room, looking at the right deal flow, understanding what a great family office looks like, what best in class family office operations are, right? That's a very applicable skill set. So we tell families, you want these candidates to be out in the market to some extent, because this world where it used to just be a trust officer that you brought in, and it was a very insular job where you just were processing tax forms and K-1s and doing bill pay, like those days are gone. It's a much more dynamic environment, and the requirements for the candidates are equally as dynamic. So part of it is just knowing, right, to be on my radar, to attend my networking events, to be able to kind of text me and know when something is coming along. And then as we get to know those candidates, to be able to have in our kind of mental Rolodex, oh, this person would be terrific for this role. This is the once in a lifetime opportunity where it makes sense for them to really take a chance here. So I think that's how I would view it from a candidate perspective. In the States, there just aren't that many specialized recruiters. So you really just have to know.
Yeah. And maybe a question for you, David. So thinking a little bit about, how do you, as someone who's looking to get into the sector, maybe you've been headhunted, how do you know that you're actually the right fit, that this is going to be a good job for you and a good life decision?
Certainly. So I find usually it's candidates who have had experience somewhere else and are looking to just take the next step. As Brian said earlier, it's the service-driven culture that you really need to be on board with. And if you have a strong background in both the technical capability as well as having that service-driven focus, then this is something that could be open, could be an opportunity that would be great for you. I think it is really about getting to know the recruiters, and we get to know the candidates very well over time, so that when we make introductions, we are making introductions of candidates that we've known for several years. They're not necessarily just people that we've just recently connected with, and you start to learn how different people's organizations are structured, just because you can see kind of if they had an operating business or, they had something in the past, you can kind of see the types of characteristics that they look for in individuals. And if you're thinking about kind of transitioning into this field, then those are the types of things you want to see what you align with.
Yep. Perfect. Maybe sort of diving a little bit more into, the actual process of going through this recruitment journey and sort of developing your talent and your culture internally. So thinking a little bit about, some of the challenges that a family office might face when they begin to kind of engage with the process, so outlining some here, it might be, you have this pipeline of amazing interviews. How do you actually go about sort of managing that process? What would you recommend to a family who's got a bunch of interesting interviews, great candidates coming up? How do you sort of handhold them through that process? Prasada?
So you have to be the trusted advisor for some time. In my experience, you can't go in there cold and just give them a list of people that they should look at. So in the way that we approach the search is that we complete the search it might be controversial to say this, but in 4 weeks' time. So all we do for 12 hours a day is that particular search day in, day out, until we have a full map of the candidates that are out there. So we don't just look at our database. I'm a big believer that you should approach this like a thesis and target every company that is out there that is similar and provide the list. Of course, we have GDPR things in Europe that we have to be compliant, but we provide a document. So in that list, we give them all the companies that we approached and all the candidates that have agreed to speak and have given us permission to share their details, and also our search data that we completed, so with a list of people. And of course, this is all public stuff, so we're not going on a personal way to get this information. So when the family office has come to me as a headhunter, they have exhausted their pipeline. They have looked themselves and have been either unsuccessful or they're not sure, or sometimes they just want to see who they missed. So, and it's important as an executive search firm to, talk about the retainer, because it has to be substantial, and you also have to understand your client. I'm sure Brian and David and I have been where we've given them an amazing list when they had decided not to hire because they were just seeing who's out there. But we do a very thorough search, so we make sure that we have not missed anybody, and it's normally a long process. So although we give the list quite quickly, it takes many months before we cross that line of bringing that right person in. But it's a case of being a trusted headhunter to these family offices. A lot of our clients have been recommendations. They seem to all work together or know of each other. So we have really relied on our network and very little on the business development side in order to bring and attract these clients, especially in the Middle East region, because they all sort of trust each other and work together. So if they hear of one good headhunter, you end up working with them. So I've worked with these family offices. So I began my company, and they still remained with me. So, but it's based on trust and being able to do the best. They know that you are the best headhunter out there, and that you're going to give them a very thorough search, and that you haven't missed anybody, and you're not just calling people off your database, but doing a search externally as well.
Yep.
It's
a relationship business, right?
Of course.
That thorough search thing there is very key, because a lot of the times if you go to, say, a Korn Ferry or a larger firm that doesn't have a special firm focused on family office, they miss the nuance, the relationships that you have to be able to successfully execute this type of role. So, they'll be great at finding operationally great, excellent people, but those people moving into an environment that's more of a service-driven culture is not necessarily going to correlate. So having the experience of working with a lot of these family offices, we kind of know what we're looking for in that sense.
Yeah, and to add to that, David, sorry, this is the trouble with executive search firms like ours to grow to a large number. And I'm asked the question of, why don't you have more employees? Well, you can't control the searches. So you're not able to do a very good job if you have 20 people in the company or more. You have to be able to be very thorough and clinical in the way that you approach searches. So for us, it's not becoming the biggest. It's a case of doing the best job and continuing these relationships and maintaining these relationships.
Yeah, I can't resist piggybacking on top of all the comments. Obviously, this is the world we live in, but the typical playbook of a large search firm where they get the profile of the candidate and they try to poach somebody who, works at a similar profile firm, but is just 1 or 2 degrees below, and they throw a big comp number at them, doesn't really work in the family office space. The consultative approach and the boutique, we're all obviously white glove boutique firms here, just because the family office world is so idiosyncratic, and each family, even though there are similarities in terms of AUM and scale once you get to a certain size, but they're all different, right? Based on the story and how they got there. So it is really important. And a lot of these firms will look towards their kind of traditional fishing holes of private equity and wealth management, and the technical skills might be there, but again, the culture fit is really challenging. And so for us, we built up a database over 25 years of all these family office folks that we've developed contacts with, but we're also on the road pretty much every week, going to conferences, putting together discrete coffee networks, dinners, we're all members of these various networks that we really leverage fully for each individual custom search to make sure we're going as wide and deep as we possibly can. So, member of YPO, member of IPI, Campton, organizations like Simple, these newsletters, it all kind of comes together, and it all really does make a huge difference.
Yeah.
I think another interesting thing is, and you probably have that in your space as well, is in technology, you'll have a lot of family offices coming out of one particular business. And so they'll all start to have very, very similar cultures because of the way that they have operated and they're high scaling businesses. So then kind of being able to build relationships with all of these people, they become a little bit more interchangeable at that point. But you have to also know who the players are, because no one wants to be stealing people from their friends and so on, which is, not necessarily something you would have to deal with in a regular business. So,
yeah. Well, I guess we've had some interesting questions, and so Jürgen's actually brought one up, which is, keen to see how the family offices still stay competitive on a comp level, with family offices pushing back and increasing costs, regardless of other motivations outside of comp. So let's talk a little bit more about compensation and terms. Obviously, family offices, regions all vary and are quite different, but how are family offices beginning to approach compensation in an increasingly competitive environment?
I think they're less rigid, so there's more room for movement and getting the right. If they want the right, if they have the right person in front of them, you will be amazed the kind of compensation they can put together. So what's amazing about family offices is that it's not rigid, it's not a corporate. So it's not a case of you fall in the box or here or there. But it really varies. I find that Middle Eastern family offices pay extremely well. There is, of course, no tax as well. And in particular in Bahrain, they provide homes. And so it depends on which region you're looking at. Of course, in Europe is a little bit different. But what's important, because we have to look at a family office like a company, it depends on the size of it and what's required from this person. So in terms of compensation, it really depends on how much they are managing. So it will vary, I find. I'm happy to share numbers, but it will depend on the size. So I think it'll be interesting to hear what David and Brian think from America. But yeah, it depends on the size.
I'm not sure if you have this as well, but one of the things that we find is that the relationship the principals have with the individuals can completely change comp. So once people have been in roles for a while, there's really no sort of structure to them. It depends upon the relationships that they have. So that can often be difficult for people that want to move from one family office to another, because they may have very, very generous compensation at one business, and it's just not necessarily transferable until they build that rapport and relationship over on the other side. So
just to add to David, they are family members. Essentially, they become like family members, so they're very well taken care of after a few years of being in the family office. Yeah, it's a good place to be if people are looking to enter that world.
Yeah, I think this dovetails really nicely with how we started the conversation about why it's an attractive place to go if you're a candidate, especially an investment candidate, because these families have an edge a lot of times in terms of the permanency of capital and the patient capital base that they have their own kind of internal investment committees and credit committees. I think families are now realizing that advantage that they had on the investment side from a capital perspective is now an advantage that they can use to leverage for retaining and obtaining talent, right? So that flexibility to put into place deferred compensation, long-term incentive plans, participation in carried interest, or even a profit share if you're a key employee within the family office itself, is just huge in terms of being able to attract really top-tier talent today. And you can get very complex and sophisticated with some of these comp structures. And so that's what we're saying is families are getting a lot smarter with understanding that they're competing directly with some of these more traditional private equity and asset management firms, but they can outcompete a lot of times because they're largely unregulated. They have a lot of flexibility and a lot more creativity at their hands.
Yeah. I guess thinking a little bit more about, perhaps some red flags. This obviously is it's a personal business. You're bringing someone in. You sort of really have to know. You trust these individuals who you are entrusting with your personal affairs. As a family office, what are some red flags that they should be looking out for when it comes to the process as a whole, and for managing new clients coming in, new candidates coming in to their organizations? Maybe I'll start actually with you, David.
Yeah, so something interesting that I see in this space is, because I'm so used to doing confidential searches, we don't necessarily have too much of a brand story or an employer story to be able to share with the individuals coming in. And about a year ago, I actually did a search for a very public figure, and they actually allowed me to utilize their name in the reaching out to candidates. And we had to do the shiny object test all over again to make sure that they were coming in because of wanting to be the best operator and have the service level excellence, not necessarily because they were interested in the celebrity of the kind of individual that they were going to be supporting. And I've seen this happen time and time again, especially with bringing people in that you've perhaps known through your life, whether that's college friends or whatnot, and they haven't got the experience necessarily, and they're just very interested in being connected to those individuals. And so that's an advantage, I think, from a search firm perspective, is we're able to screen for that. But I do think that can be a really big red flag, just assessing the motivations of someone coming on board.
Yep. Perfect. What are your sort of thoughts, Prasada? Any sort of red flags from a candidate perspective, particularly, I guess, in a Middle East perspective, where it is incredibly sort of family centric, right?
I think for them, it's more a case of the motivations of the candidate going there. Is it going to be, in particular at this time, is it going to be a temporary thing? So does the person want to move to that region and work for that family office because it's very quiet in Europe, or are they there long term? So these are sort of the red flags that they look for, and they're very careful at interviewing the person. And usually the process can take up to a year because of that, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. But to flip it on the other side, we're seeing more the candidates in family offices that are sort of slightly frustrated sometimes because they want to move quicker. And if they've come from an entrepreneurial background, they really want to, get things done very quickly. And it's not how it moves in the family office. Sometimes there are going to be quiet periods. But from a family office hiring someone, it's how long are you going to stay? Are you here temporarily, or are you here long term? And they want to see long term.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Brian, maybe a question. Majority of the world's workforce today are millennials and Gen Z, right? And a lot of family offices may not necessarily align with some of those new ways of working. Are you beginning to kind of see a change in culture and request? Are there sort of watch outs to consider? Okay.
Yeah. So only in the family office industry would I be, as a 42-year-old, considered young. But I am indeed in this world. We're seeing probably, well, it's a little bit calmer now in the summer, but in Q1 and Q2, we were seeing once a week, once every other week, an inbound call, and the fact pattern was pretty similar. Family office executive, or maybe it was a family office member who acted as a principal, is 65 to 75 years old. They've been in the seat for 20 plus years. They're now in a place where they want to retire. They wanted to kind of work their way through COVID. They're not really interested in sticking around for another political transition. It's time for them to go to the beach and drink margaritas. And they need help figuring out how to backfill them and find a new head for their family office or the investment protocol. And I think that's just, in the States, a function of demographics, right? We have this huge baby boomer population that's retiring at an enormous clip, and it's peaking as we're speaking right now. And there just aren't enough people my age, millennials and Gen X and older Gen Zs, there aren't enough people in my generational cohort with the skills required and the experience required to step into those shoes. So it's becoming a very competitive landscape. I think that's why a lot of families are now relying on executive recruiters like ourselves to help them through that process. A big challenge that we have is oftentimes when we go meet with the family, either virtually or in person, we walk into the boardroom and it's a group of 65 to 75-year-old people. And we say, listen, you seem like a great family. We'd love to help you and work with you. It's not going to be a very competitive process for us on the candidate side unless you have some type of next generational representation here in the room, because candidates who are my age are looking at this as a 10 to 15 year opportunity. They look around, they say, well, who's going to be here when this transition occurs? I need to build this relationship with the next layer of family member leadership. And so oftentimes we push families to include a next gen on the search committee, include them on the investment committee, have a pathway for them to have board representation, bring in independent board members at a competitive compensation, which is always a challenge. And that world is changing, but slowly, just so that there's a more robust representation for these candidates and the position for them to step into. And it's uncomfortable sometimes because these folks have been in charge for 20 or 30 years. But again, in this competitive landscape, you really need to see that occur. And oftentimes families are very open to it. But that's the big transition we're seeing. And frankly, one of the reasons Linda recruited me to join the firm about a year ago is I think families were asking her rightfully, well, if we're going to be filling out this C-suite over the next 10 years, what's your own plan for succession? And so we kind of ate our own dog food on that one.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, maybe switching gears a little bit to that sort of, an eye on the horizon. So if we think a little bit about family offices, we obviously live in quite interesting times. What is it that makes you so optimistic and excited to be working in this space today? Maybe I'll start with you, Prasada.
Well, I think family office is going to dominate in the next 10 to 15 years. And this is just because where we are. I think it's about 10 trillion that is owned by family offices. And we are seeing continuous people exiting and starting up family offices. So a lot of the world problems will be solved, I believe, by family offices and ultra high net worth individuals. I'm seeing a lot of third generation wealth that is focused on philanthropy a lot, and they are going to co-invest. From a company perspective, you're better off going to a family office rather than going to a PE or a VC. Especially VC world has gone very quiet, as we know. So I think it's one of the space to be, and it's going to solve probably problems like global warming. So I don't think corporations are going to do that, and I don't think governments are going to do that. So it's an exciting area to be in, and that's why a platform like Simple is phenomenal to be able to bring them together. And this mysterious industry of family offices are going to start slowly opening the doors. What I'm starting to see is family offices co-investing. And actually, as headhunters, it is our job, and we should probably try and do a little bit more in introducing them and bringing them together. I came from an event where we spent a few long days together with a bunch of people that owned family offices. And that was a very exciting thing to see how they're starting to, the first 2 days, everybody was very quiet. And then they started talking about co-investing together. And we're following up with more meetings now where people are actually going to meet in various parts of the world. So I think this is the space to be in. Of course, some of the family offices potentially might need to sort of close down because it's a broad brush to call something a family office. It really has to be under the right circumstances, in the sense of, in my opinion, it has to be about 250 million to 300 million to operate, or where it's worth it to be a family office. And sometimes you see companies that sort of operate like a holding company, but that are called family offices. So we've got to potentially filter that out. But I think it's a very exciting space to invest in companies such as AI, and solve problems like global warming.
Yeah. Maybe a cheeky question on AI. I'll ask it to you, David, because obviously you're based in Silicon Valley. Thinking a little bit more about how might AI help you better serve family offices? How are you seeing it beginning to kind of sort of interrupt this space as well?
Well, in terms of the recruiting aspect of it, we're playing with things all of the time that are helping us in terms of building candidate profiles and reviewing candidates. We have some tools that we use for sourcing, which to Bezado's point before, one of the challenges in this business is being able to scale or to be able to grow your headcount internally to be able to support the needs. And in the past, we've not necessarily been able to do that. The standards and the nuance that we understand of working with these principles has not been easily replicatable in hiring individuals, especially from a space that is a lot of the time is focused on the sales aspect of search. And that's really not what we do. Many times, I'm sure the other two as well would walk away from candidates in maintaining the relationship. And so being able to utilize some AI tools to be able to assist us in being able to get a greater reach or be able to do more follow-up, get connected with more candidates, those things are all exciting opportunities for us as we see. And so we can spend more of our time working on the personal relationships.
Brilliant. Well, I might wrap it there. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for joining today's webinar on family office recruitment and executive search. If you would like to learn more about family office recruitment, you can log in or sign up for a complimentary account to access Simple's comprehensive family office recruitment guide, which each of our guests today has contributed to. So with your account, you can post free family office job roles and connect with Simple's webinar guests directly and further explore a broad array of guides, tools, data, and services across the Simple platform. Stay tuned for our next upcoming webinar to be announced shortly, and make sure to sort of follow Brian, David, and Bersada's on LinkedIn as well. Thank you so much for your time today, and goodbye.